A police officer kicked a girl in a wheelchair right in the street, just to show his power, but he made one fatal mistake. He didn't know who her father was. Seconds later, Chuck Norris showed up, and the officer instantly regretted everything. Hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. You don't want to miss this story. Chuck Norris had traveled through many small towns in his life, places where the wind carried the dust of long, quiet roads, and the sunset seemed to linger a bit too long, as if time itself moved slower. But as he stepped off the bus and looked around this particular town, a place with neat brick buildings, narrow sidewalks, and a police station that towered proudly in the center, he felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with travel. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag on his shoulder and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of fresh asphalt, old trees, and something else too. Tension. There was a stillness here that felt unnatural, a kind of strained order that whispered beneath the everyday routine of the townspeople. His boots struck the pavement with familiar heaviness as he walked through the small parking lot toward the taxi stand. Though the journey had been tiring, his posture remained straight, powerful, and confident. Years of combat, stunts, and discipline had carved that into him. The years had also etched lines into his face, subtle reminders of battles both physical and emotional. Yet his eyes, sharp, alert, and observant still, held the fire of the warrior he had always been. He scanned the area out of habit, noting the details others might ignore. The way the patrol cars were positioned, the posters featuring a decorated police officer's face taped to several shop windows, and the wary glances from a few individuals lingering near the bus stop. Chuck tried to push away the unease building inside him. This trip was supposed to be about something far more important than instinct or suspicion. It was about his daughter. He hadn't seen her in several weeks. The accident had changed everything. Before, she had been a vibrant young woman, active, social, unstoppable. Then her car had been struck by a reckless driver, and in the aftermath of shattered metal and broken glass, she had lost the use of her legs. The hospital hours, the surgeries, the first moments she realized she couldn't stand. Chuck had been there for many of those moments, and each one had carved its own scar into his heart. No amount of martial arts mastery or military heroism had prepared him for the pain of seeing his child suffer. And though she had survived, the life she returned to was nothing like the one she had known. His daughter had been moved to this town for specialized rehabilitation. It was a place known for its cutting-edge therapy center, offering hope for strength and adaptation. She had chosen to live independently in a small apartment nearby, determined not to let her disability cage her. Chuck admired that fierceness in her. She had inherited it from him. But her insistence on independence also terrified him. He feared that one day she would need help and no one would be there. That fear was what kept him from resting, even now. He hailed a cab, giving the driver the address he'd scribbled onto a folded paper. As they drove through the town, his gaze flickered from one side of the road to the other. Storefronts passed by, children on bicycles, a couple walking their dog. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. He saw one of the posters again, a smiling officer in full uniform, medals pinned neatly to his chest. Underneath, in bold letters, "Heroes live among us." The hero's face triggered a strange twinge of familiarity in Chuck, a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite capture. But the cab turned a corner before he could dwell on it further. They reached his daughter's apartment building, a modest complex with a small accessible ramp leading to a glass door. He thanked the driver and walked up to the entrance, pressing the buzzer. For a moment, there was silence. Then his daughter's voice came through the speaker, warm and light, though he could detect the hint of effort behind it. "Dad, you made it!" The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open. Inside, she waited with a wide smile, though the wheelchair in which she sat reflected a new chapter neither had chosen. Seeing her sitting there strong yet vulnerable hit him like a punch to the chest. But he masked the emotion quickly and stepped forward to hug her, careful but firm. "I missed you," she murmured against his shoulder. "I missed you more," he replied, and he meant it. They moved into the living room, decorated with personal touches, small paintings, photos from before the accident, motivational notes pinned to a board. Yet even with these touches of personality, Chuck could see signs of adjustment. Lowered shelves, grab bars, a specialized cushion on the wheelchair, and ramps covering the thresholds. He observed quietly, taking in every detail, memorizing the challenges she faced daily. He wondered how many times she had struggled here alone. She rolled closer to the kitchenette, demonstrating the smoothness of her maneuvering. He noticed a small device attached to her chair, a mounted camera angled outward. She followed his gaze and gave a small, proud grin. "I started a blog," she explained, "about accessibility, therapy, rebuilding life. Showing people what's possible instead of what's lost." He nodded slowly, pride rising in him like warmth. "That's my girl." Her eyes glimmered. "I want to show you the therapy center later. There's a session today, and I'd love for you to come. You could meet my physical trainer and see some of the progress I've made." Chuck didn't even hesitate. "Of course, I'll be right there with you." But just then, his phone vibrated. He glanced down and saw an unfamiliar number, but the text message displayed a few familiar names. Old names, comrades, veterans he hadn't seen in years. They were gathering at a local pub. Tonight, here, in this very town. His heart stumbled. What were the odds? She noticed the shift in his expression. "Everything okay?" He tried to hide the conflict inside him but failed. "It's a reunion. Guys I served with. I didn't know any of them were nearby." Her face softened. She knew what that meant. Those men had been his brothers once, and reunions like that didn't come often. "You should go," she said gently. "I can get to therapy myself. I do it all the time." Chuck hesitated. "But I told you I'd be there." She wheeled closer and touched his hand. "Dad, it's okay, really. I want you to go. I'll record some of the session, show you afterward. It's not like I'm helpless." He winced inwardly at the word, but she said it with a smirk. She was defying pity even now. He knelt slightly, leveling their gaze. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive. You'll see me at the center afterward. Promise." After a long moment, he nodded. He couldn't deny her agency. She deserved the freedom she fought so hard to reclaim. He watched as she prepared to leave, placing items into a small backpack, checking the wheels of her chair, locking her apartment behind them. When she reached the curb, she clicked on her camera. "Every journey counts," she said with quiet determination, and the recording light blinked red. Chuck stood there a moment longer, watching her navigate down the sidewalk. Her movements were confident, precise, yet he couldn't ignore the fragile truth beneath them. She moved forward into a world that was rarely kind to those who weren't standing. He finally turned the other direction, heading toward the pub where ghosts of his past awaited. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling rising once again inside him. Something in this town felt wrong. Something in the air warned him that this newfound peace could break with the slightest pressure. And soon, much sooner than either of them expected, it would. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the narrow streets as Chuck made his way toward the small pub where the reunion was meant to take place. The town seemed calm on the surface, the kind of place where people casually greeted each other and children raced scooters along sidewalks. Yet every few steps, he caught another glimpse of the decorated officer from the posters, his image displayed on community boards, shop windows, and even a banner stretched above the entrance to a municipal building. Something about that face gnawed at the edges of Chuck's memory, as though history itself were trying to tug him backward. But the more he tried to focus on it, the more it seemed to slip away, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten names. Meanwhile, his daughter propelled herself steadily along the opposite direction, rolling down the sidewalk with a growing confidence that both reassured and unsettled Chuck. The smooth motion of her wheels came from weeks of relentless effort, and each push of her hands against the rims carried both determination and defiance. She was proving to herself, to him, and to the world that she refused to be defined by the accident that had changed her life. The mounted camera on her chair blinked its tiny red light, recording her journey, documenting her message to anyone who might one day need encouragement. That strength could be rebuilt, even when the body had been broken. The street sloped slightly, funneling loud traffic toward a crossroads where the day's frustration simmered beneath hot metal and impatient engines. A delivery truck blocked part of the lane ahead, forcing cars to brake abruptly and angry drivers to lean on their horns. The noise reverberated in the air, sharp and grating. She stopped for a moment, taking stock of the cluttered roadway and weighing her options. The sidewalk had narrowed significantly, pinched by trash bins and a jutting fence. There was no safe way forward except a short detour toward the street's edge, where a narrow strip of asphalt remained free of cars. She hesitated only a moment before maneuvering carefully downward, trying to stay as close to the curb as possible. Her heart began to beat faster. The roar of engines and sudden bursts of frustration from drivers reminded her all too easily of screeching brakes and the shattering sound of glass the night of her accident. Still, she kept her head up and continued to roll forward, telling herself that panic had no place here. She had crossed much tougher thresholds than this. She breathed steadily and focused on the path, guiding her wheels around obstacles, hoping just to pass through the chaos and reach the rehabilitation center a few blocks ahead. But the town's traffic problems had already caught the attention of a police cruiser weaving through the congested line of cars with sirens briefly flashing. The black and white vehicle eased into the space just ahead of her, blocking the narrow lane where she traveled, and the door swung open with abrupt force. A uniformed officer stepped out tall, broad, his boots polished to a shine, the edges of his sleeves starched stiffly. His posture radiated authority, but his eyes burned with irritation. She froze instinctively as those eyes locked onto her like she was an obstruction rather than a person. "What are you doing on the roadway?" he barked, his voice echoing above the constant honking. She tried to reply calmly, even though her pulse hammered inside her. "The sidewalk was blocked," she explained, hands pressed firm on the wheels, trying to maintain balance and composure. "I'm just trying to get through." He strode closer, his steps clipped and forceful. His shadow fell over her, swallowing the sunlight she had been pushing toward only seconds earlier. Up close, she could see the tightly clenched jaw and the faint lines of irritation around his eyes. His badge glinted sharply under the sun, numbers reflecting a flash of brightness into the camera's lens. "So now you think you can just roll in the middle of traffic?" he demanded. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're causing?" She swallowed, aware of the growing audience, drivers craning their necks, pedestrians pausing with curious caution. Her camera captured everything, but she doubted the officer even noticed. "I didn't have a choice," she said, a small tremor escaping her voice despite every effort to keep steady. "I couldn't go forward on the sidewalk." The officer scoffed, a harsh laugh slicing through his anger. "People like you always think the world has to stop and bend around your need," he snapped. "Well, guess what? It doesn't." The words hit her harder than she expected. They stripped away layers of confidence she had fought to rebuild. She wanted to defend herself, to say that she never asked for special treatment, only dignity. But before she could gather those thoughts, the officer reached out abruptly and gripped the handles of her wheelchair as if it were merely an object out of place, a piece of furniture blocking the way. He jerked it slightly to one side, testing her balance, startling her so much that she instinctively grabbed the armrest to keep herself steady. "Stop!" she gasped, breath catching in her throat as she realized how close her wheels were to slipping off the edge of the curb. The asphalt below felt like a void waiting to swallow her. But he didn't stop. His irritation seemed to grow with each passing second. "You're in the road," he snarled. "That alone is a violation. You're lucky I'm not writing you up right now." "Ah." He gave the chair a sharper shove, and it tilted dangerously, tilting her torso sideways against the strap that held her centered. A small cry escaped her lips, not from pain, but from sheer terror as the wheels dangled inches from the moving cars beneath. Traffic had slowed to a sluggish crawl, but the danger felt no less real. The world blurred at the edges as panic threatened to overwhelm her. She raised one hand defensively, palm outward, while her other hand clung desperately to the rim of a wheel, trying to stabilize herself. "Please, just stop," she whispered. But it was as if he didn't hear her at all. Or worse, he didn't care. His boot rose slightly and she realized with horror what was coming next. There was no time to brace or reason. He kicked not hard enough to topple the chair completely, but strong enough that the force jarred through her lower back and sent a shock of pain up her spine. Her body lurched violently, and the chair leaned even farther toward the drop. Tires screeched, Horns blared loudly as a car swerved away to avoid collision. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A few phones were pointed in her direction now, their screens capturing the scene. Her camera recorded everything. Her breath hitched as the officer stepped back with a cold, dismissive expression, as though satisfied he had made his point, but still far from calm. Tears prickled the corners of her eyes, not from physical injury, but from the crushing fear and humiliation. For those moments, she was no longer the resilient fighter documenting her comeback to life. She was a vulnerable woman trapped in a chair that could betray her balance at any moment. She fought to steady her breathing and tried once more to adjust the chair back from the edge. Her fingers trembled as she pushed against the wheel, trying to level herself. A gust of wind brushed across her cheeks, carrying the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Someone in the crowd muttered something indistinct. Another person pulled out their phone but stayed frozen, unwilling to step forward. Her mind raced with thoughts she didn't want to face. She had taught herself not to feel like a burden or a spectacle, but now humiliation rolled through her like thunder. She had worked so hard for independence, to show she was capable and strong, and yet here she was, shaken, scared, and barely able to protect herself from a man in uniform who held all the power in this moment. The weight of that truth pressed painfully down on her chest. The officer straightened his belt and took a step closer again, his boldness undeterred by the silent witnesses. "See what happens when you think you're special?" he muttered cruelly. "You should have stayed on the sidewalk. Don't think the rules don't apply just because you're sitting down." The words stung like open wounds torn wider. She tried once more to speak, but the knot tightening in her throat made the words break apart. All she could do was stare back at him with wide, devastated eyes, praying the encounter would end before the situation grew worse. The sun glinted sharply off the mounted camera as it continued recording, capturing every sneer, every shove, every second of her rising terror. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps quickened, and a familiar presence was moving nearer, though she was still too consumed by fear to notice. The town traffic raged on, the crowd watched with uncertain silence, and the officer seemed poised to escalate again, his power feeding on the absence of consequences. She clung tightly to her chair, hoping desperately for the ordeal to end. She reminded herself, this is only temporary. This moment will not define me. But tears escaped her eyes despite her will, streaking down her cheeks as she teetered between helplessness and the determination not to break. Every part of the town seemed to hold its breath, and Chuck Norris was getting closer. Chuck's footsteps echoed briskly along the sidewalk as he turned the corner, the warm evening glow casting his shadow long behind him. The reunion at the pub had been shorter than anyone anticipated. He couldn't relax there, not while thoughts of his daughter kept tugging at his attention like an invisible hand. Something inside him would not calm down. It was the same instinct that had saved his life many times before, a sharp intuition that danger was close and that the people he cared about needed him. He had tried to ignore the feeling at first, telling himself he was being overprotective, that she was safe. But with every passing minute, the uneasiness grew heavier in his chest. So he excused himself abruptly and headed toward the rehabilitation center, walking faster with each beat of his pulse. As he moved through the heart of town, the noise of traffic swelled around him. Angry honks, raised voices, a stalled line of cars stretching into the distance. People gathered near a crosswalk, their attention focused forward with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Chuck slowed his pace slightly, scanning the scene ahead. A familiar silhouette caught the corner of his eye. His daughter's wheelchair, precariously close to the curb, its backrest tilted awkwardly. Her body was leaning sideways, one hand gripping the wheel so hard that her knuckles were pale. The other hand trembled toward her chest. Her breathing was sharp, and fear etched itself into every line of her face. Chuck's heart jolted violently. Standing over her was a police officer, broad-shouldered, imposing, uniform immaculate, but his posture radiated aggression rather than protection. His stance was tense, his manner harsh and threatening, and when Chuck's eyes reached the man's face, he felt time fracture into two realities. The present moment of danger and a memory from long ago. Sand, smoke, a battlefield, a wounded soldier he had dragged to safety. The recognition struck him like a blow. He knew that officer. He had once called him a brother. But that was before. There was no hesitation. Chuck surged forward, swift and decisive. In his daughter's wide, frightened eyes, he saw the moment she noticed him. Relief flickered there, but the fear didn't fade. He felt a cold fury twist inside his chest as he heard the officer speak to her again, voice low and disdainful, as though trying to provoke another reaction. "Hey!" Chuck's voice cut through the scene, stopping conversations, turning heads. The officer turned around sharply. When he saw who was approaching, confusion crossed his face. Just a flicker at first, then tension deepened in his jaw. Recognition dawned on him too. "Chuck," he muttered, disbelief rippling across his features. But before he could say more, Chuck was already standing between him and the young woman in the chair. He didn't raise his fists or show aggression. His presence alone was enough to change the air. Calm, controlled authority radiated from him like an invisible shield. "What are you doing to her?" Chuck asked quietly, dangerously quiet. His voice carried not rage, but a certainty that could not be argued with. The crowd leaned in as if pulled by the gravity of the moment. The officer tried to straighten his posture, adjusting his holster and squaring his shoulders. "She was obstructing traffic," he snapped back. "I was moving her out of the way. She could have caused an accident." Chuck glanced at the cars that had already slowed to a crawl long before she reached the road. The horns had ceased the moment he appeared. Drivers watched now, silent, tension replacing their impatience. "She's not the danger," Chuck replied, his voice steady as steel. "You are." The officer bristled and reached for her chair again, perhaps hoping to assert control or save face in front of onlookers. Chuck reacted before the officer's hand got close. One step forward, a firm grip securing the man's wrist, redirecting his motion downward. The officer stumbled, startled, and Chuck used that brief imbalance to guide him back without striking. Just enough to make him understand that force had consequences when misused. The officer tried again, more recklessly this time, fueled by embarrassment and anger. But Chuck had spent a lifetime mastering precision. With smooth, efficient movements, he blocked the officer's arm, pivoted, and subtly shifted weight, just enough to guide the man to his knees on the sidewalk. No theatrics, no violence beyond necessity. He made it look effortless, and yet no one present doubted the power behind those restrained motions. Gasps rose from the crowd. A few phones lifted higher, cameras capturing every second. The officer struggled, breath coming fast, frustration twisting across his features. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Chuck's voice remained calm. "I think you forgot what protecting people looks like." He adjusted his grip so the officer couldn't reach for his sidearm, ensuring the situation remained controlled. Then he turned partially toward his daughter. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded shakily, wiping the tears that refused to stop. "Yeah," she managed, but her trembling voice spoke the truth. She was far from okay. Chuck gently released the officer and stepped back, positioning himself as a barrier once again. The officer rose, anger radiating from him, but he didn't charge forward, not now. Chuck's presence was an unshakable wall, and everyone there could see the shift in power. Sirens approached backup, responding to a call none of them had heard. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and officers exited cautiously, unsure whom to assess first. Some recognized the restrained officer, others recognized Chuck Norris. That alone reset the balance of the moment. Paramedics emerged next, alerted by bystanders. They hurried toward his daughter, asking questions, checking for injuries. Chuck remained at her side, hand resting gently on her shoulder, grounding her while she regained her composure. Her camera, still recording, documented every moment her father's arrival, the sudden shift from fear to safety, the justice that began when he stepped forward. The officer on the ground tried to defend his actions to his colleagues, his voice desperate, citing protocols and traffic safety. But the truth had already played out in full view and on video. His words lacked weight against the undeniable clarity of what everyone had seen. Chuck made sure her wheelchair was upright and stable again. He checked her arms, her breathing, the tremble still coursing through her. There was no major physical injury, thankfully, but the emotional wound ran deep. He knew the scars of humiliation could last longer than those of bone or muscle. They were escorted to the police station for statements. The officer was brought too, though he avoided Chuck's gaze, bitterness souring his once confident demeanor. At the station, walls of bureaucracy rose around them, questions, paperwork, official expressions that tried to appear neutral but couldn't hide discomfort. Some officers looked at Chuck with a cautious respect. Others looked at him as though he were a complication they didn't want to deal with. Throughout it all, Chuck never raised his voice, but the exhaustion in his daughter's eyes and the betrayal he still felt when he looked at the man he once saved fed a fire inside him that was far from extinguished. By the time they were allowed to leave, night had begun to fall. The cool air brushed gently against them as they stepped outside, where the world seemed quieter, but not calmer. She clutched the camera close to her chest now, the blinking light finally switched off. The footage inside it held the power to reveal truth that would otherwise be buried beneath uniforms and badges. Chuck stood beside her, his jaw tight, his thoughts heavy. They left the station together, but the battle was only beginning. For now, though, he was there, and she was safe. The fluorescent lights inside the police station flickered with a low electrical buzz, casting a sterile glow over everything they touched. Chuck sat beside his daughter in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Her breathing had mostly steadied now, but every so often a tremor ran through her fingers as she replayed the moment in her mind, those few terrifying seconds that had nearly thrown her into the path of a moving car. The officer who had attacked her was being led into an adjacent room, his expression a volatile mix of anger and embarrassment. Several of his colleagues looked away when his eyes met theirs. Authority had slipped from him the moment Chuck intervened, and power lost can sour a man's pride into venom. Chuck knew this atmosphere well, rooms where truth was something to be negotiated, where uniforms acted as shields against accountability, where silence was a tool sharper than any blade. His jaw tightened slightly as one of the senior officers approached them, with a cautious, almost placating smile. The officer's badge gleamed beneath the harsh overhead lighting, but his eyes held calculations rather than concern. "We appreciate your cooperation," he began, tone unnaturally smooth. "It appears there may have been a misunderstanding out there." Chuck leaned forward slightly, muscles coiled beneath his calm exterior. "There was no misunderstanding," he said evenly. "Everyone saw what happened, and it's all recorded." His daughter lifted her camera with both hands, still shaken, but steady enough to show she meant business. The blinking recording light had been off since they entered the station, but everything before that moment remained preserved. The senior officer's smile faltered for just a heartbeat before returning in a strained curve. "Well," he tried again, "traffic situations can escalate quickly. Our officer was only trying to ensure safety. Perhaps your daughter inadvertently—" Chuck didn't need to raise his voice. His stare alone was enough to silence the man. "Don't blame her for the choices he made." The room seemed to grow colder around them. The officer cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "We will review the footage, of course. These situations are best handled internally. A swift internal evaluation and a private resolution—" "No," Chuck interrupted, voice sharp as iron. "Nothing gets buried, not this time." Even in the brightness of the station, the officer's face darkened. Authority was used to obedience, and Chuck's refusal cut sharply through the routine script. He exchanged a quick glance with another uniform across the room, one of unease. Chuck could see the truth in their bodies, in their eyes. This wasn't the first complaint lodged against that officer. This wasn't the first time fear outweighed justice. But every earlier victim lacked what his daughter possessed in this moment: undeniable video evidence, and a father who would go to the ends of the earth for her. His daughter, still clutching the camera, spoke for the first time in that tense silence. "I'm posting the video." Her voice cracked lightly but did not weaken. "People deserve to see what he did." The senior officer's mask fell for a moment. Something cold and commanding flashed across his features before he quickly tried to hide it behind civility. "Miss, I strongly advise against—" "It's her choice," Chuck said, and there was no room for debate. A small nod passed between father and daughter. He squeezed her shoulder gently, silently reminding her that she was not alone. She unlocked the camera, scrolled to the recorded segment, and transferred the file to her phone. With trembling thumbs but unwavering intention, she opened her blog app and began uploading the raw footage. The senior officer opened his mouth to protest again, but another officer, younger, watching from a distance, stepped forward. "Sir," the younger man said quietly, "maybe we should, wait. If what's in that video is what people out there saw—" He didn't finish the sentence. His superior shot him a hard glare, and he fell silent, but the hesitation hung heavily in the air. The cracks were forming. By the time the footage finished uploading, notifications began to flood the screen. Comments, likes, shares. The view count surged so rapidly that the numbers almost blurred. Her online following, though modest, connected into wider networks instantly. People who shared, retweeted, reacted with outrage and empathy. Strangers instantly became witnesses. The truth was spreading faster than any internal statement could contain. News outlets saw it too. Phones around the station started ringing. Journalists were already seeking statements. Outside the station's entrance, the first camera crews had begun to assemble, trained eyes watching the doors for the people involved. The officer who had assaulted her sat behind a window in a holding room, his fists clenched, shoulders rigid. He looked through the glass at Chuck with a simmering expression, but Chuck's gaze was unflinching. There was no satisfaction in seeing him, contained only sadness and anger. A man who once stood beside him in battle had somehow transformed into this, someone who used his strength to harm the weak instead of protect them. Chuck wondered how much of that transformation he could have prevented. If only he had spoken up back then, noticed earlier signs, intervened before bitterness became cruelty. His daughter felt a shift inside herself. Hours earlier, she had been just another woman trying to navigate a world not built for her. Now she was the voice of a movement in the making. Strangers stood with her, and what she endured was no longer invisible. The police station's tension soon spilled into the city like rippling water. People were talking, not about traffic, not about inconveniences, but about justice. The narrative the police tried to control was slipping rapidly from their grasp. Chuck and his daughter eventually left the station together, stepping into night air thick with expectation. Streetlights cast a muted glow across the sidewalk, where groups of residents gathered in clumps, whispering urgently, scrolling through their phones, gasping at the footage. A few recognized her immediately, the girl in the wheelchair from the video, and parted respectfully to give them space. Reporters called out questions, microphones raised high, but Chuck simply placed a protective arm around his daughter and continued guiding her forward. He wasn't ready for media grandstanding. This was about her, her dignity, and the truth she had fought hard to bring into the light. As they turned down the street toward home, her phone buzzed with notifications nonstop. One message in particular caught her eye, a comment from someone she didn't know. "You're braver than you think. Thank you for speaking for those who can't." She swallowed hard, emotion rising like a warm tide. She realized how many others had perhaps endured similar humiliation without any camera or any witness willing to help. The walk was quiet for a while. Chuck heard only the rhythmic squeak of wheelchair wheels and the distant voices of gathering crowds. He recognized the shift in the air. This moment was no longer a private incident. It had become a catalyst. He glanced down at his daughter. She looked ahead with determination now. Chin lifted, tears dried. Though the memory still haunted her, it no longer owned her. She wasn't just a survivor of violence. She was igniting change. As they reached the corner, Chuck sensed the battle ahead would not be an easy one. There would be those who wanted to silence them, who would cling to power no matter what truths were exposed. Danger didn't vanish simply because the truth was visible, but that was fine. Challenges had never stopped him before, and now he had something far greater driving him. The resolve to ensure that what happened to his daughter would never happen again, to her or to anyone else. He walked a little closer to her, ready for the storm to come. The first spark had been lit, and the fire was beginning to spread. Morning came with a different silence. It was not peaceful or calm, but tense, coiled tightly like a fist pressed against the chest of the town. News vans now lined the street outside the apartment building where Chuck and his daughter lived. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like metal flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters drank coffee from paper cups, waiting for any sign of the pair who had sparked a fire they could no longer contain. Their voices, tired yet eager, filled the early hush with conversation about justice, accountability, and a town waking up to a truth that had lived in shadows for too long. Chuck stood at the window, watching them, knowing that sooner or later they would need to face those questions head-on. But not yet. His daughter needed a moment to breathe, and he would buy her every second of recovery he could. She still slept, curled slightly on her side, her fingers resting lightly against her phone. Her lifeline to a world that had suddenly decided to care. When she finally opened her eyes, sunlight poured across her room, warming the walls. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the brightness, and saw her father watching over her. The concern in his eyes softened as she stretched her arms. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, voice soft from rest and lingering exhaustion. He offered a faint smile. "I've had worse nights." She didn't need him to elaborate. His life held countless restless hours spent protecting others. But today was different. Today he was protecting her. She wheeled closer to the kitchen while he reheated some leftover breakfast. Notifications echoed from her phone nonstop, a relentless reminder that the world wanted her voice. Her blog had transformed overnight. Thousands of messages poured in. Supporters, survivors. People who had been silent for years now found courage through the image of a girl refusing to be pushed aside. But not everyone was supportive. The police union had already issued a defensive statement, spinning the incident as necessary intervention during a dangerous roadway violation. Comment sections on local forums revealed hostility accusations that she provoked the officer, that she exaggerated her vulnerability for attention, that she was turning a simple misunderstanding into a witch hunt. Some threatened legal action against her for defamation. The ugliness came in waves, determined to drown her beneath doubt. Her father took the phone gently from her trembling hands. "Don't let them break you," he said. "Truth is rarely welcomed by those who benefit from lies." Before she could reply, the doorbell rang, a sharp, demanding buzz. Chuck opened the door to find two officers in plain clothes standing on the porch. Their expressions were serious, but not hostile. One of them, a detective with tired eyes, nodded respectfully. "Mr. Norris," he began, "we need both of you to come downtown. Internal Affairs has opened an investigation. There will be hearings, testimonies. We'd like your cooperation." Chuck exchanged a glance with his daughter. She nodded once, her fear eclipsed by newfound determination. The ride to the municipal building felt surreal. The streets were lined with protesters, their signs held high with slogans demanding accountability. Some signs bore her photograph, calling her brave. Others showed the officer, the word "resign" nested beneath his printed smirk from the posters that once praised him. Now that same poster had been defaced across town, replaced with graffiti screaming a different truth. Honor comes from actions. Inside, the building's walls closed around them, like a fortress built to shield the powerful. The hearing room was filled to capacity journalists, community leaders, other officers, and people the officer had wronged, but who had never dared to speak until now. A woman with bruises hidden under sleeves, a teenage boy with a nervous twitch around uniforms, an older man who once slept behind the hardware store. Fists clenched when he saw the officer's face. One by one, they told their stories. Each testimony added another crack in the polished armor that the officer had worn so proudly. Behind the table sat the man himself, jaw tight, eyes narrowed with resentment. His attorney protested repeatedly, insisting the situations had been misinterpreted, but the room was no longer swayed by rehearsed excuses. Chuck watched silently, though emotions churned beneath his steady exterior. A guilt he had never spoken aloud gnawed at him. He knew this man, once kind, once brave, once a soldier he had trusted with his life. He remembered the battlefield moment when he pulled him from the rubble, remembered the grateful look, the whispered promise to always be worthy of that second chance. But people change. Trauma corrodes. Pride warps judgment. And Chuck had walked away, confident the world would shape his comrade into something better. Instead, it had sharpened him into a weapon wielded against the vulnerable. When it was Chuck's turn to speak, he rose slowly. The room quieted instantly. His reputation preceded him. But this was not a martial arts demonstration, not a film premiere, not applause waiting behind the silence. This was truth raw and necessary. He spoke not of violence or revenge, but of duty, of how strength was meant for protection, not dominance, of how one moment of unchecked cruelty could steal a person's dignity forever. His voice carried the weight of experience, wars fought overseas, and wars fought internally. He did not accuse. He did not insult. He simply told the story as it was. A daughter nearly shoved into speeding traffic because one man's ego could not tolerate an inconvenience. His daughter's testimony followed. Though her voice wavered at first, she steadied with every word. She spoke of humiliation, of fear, of the feeling that she might die not because of a disability, but because someone decided her life mattered less. Tears fell in the audience. Anger simmered hotter. By the time she finished, silence smothered the room. The officer's attorney made one final plea, arguing that stress in high-pressure environments could push anyone to the edge. But that argument only provoked more outrage. If the edge led to brutality, then accountability must follow. The review board announced a temporary suspension pending full disciplinary action. The officer's face twisted into bitterness, because men who thrive on domination see consequences as personal attacks rather than justice served. He pointed at Chuck with shaking fury. "You did this," he spat. "You think you're a hero? You think you're better than me? You don't have the right to destroy my career." Chuck stared back, not with anger, but with unresolved sorrow. "You destroyed it yourself," he replied quietly. Security intervened before the officer could lunge forward. He was escorted away, shouting curses fueled by helpless rage. Chuck watched him disappear around the corner, and the finality of that moment settled deep. After the hearing adjourned, the crowd outside erupted in cheers when Chuck and his daughter emerged. Signs waved high, chants echoed through the streets. She looked overwhelmed but deeply moved. People reached out to thank her, to thank them both. Justice hadn't been served fully yet, but the path was finally visible. Later that evening, as they returned home, Chuck sat alone for a moment while his daughter rested. The glow of street lights painted soft amber across the floor. His thoughts traveled back through years of war, brotherhood, silence. Regret settled heavily on him. If he had confronted his old friend's early cruelty, perhaps none of this would have happened. But guilt could not rewrite the past. Only action could write the future. And together, he and his daughter had already set that future into motion. The weeks that followed were not a quiet aftermath, but a steady and powerful awakening. The town, once a place of silent routines and unspoken rules, now stirred with purpose. The footage of the assault had rippled far beyond local borders. News stations in distant cities debated the case. Advocacy groups contacted Chuck's daughter daily, wanting her voice in discussions about disability rights and police ethics. Lawyers volunteered their services. Activists marched, demanding not only justice for her, but reforms that would reshape the very structure of local law enforcement. And within that whirlwind, Chuck and his daughter found themselves pulled into a role they had never planned for, but refused to abandon. The officer who attacked her no longer wore a badge. As the investigation deepened, more testimonies surfaced, dozens of citizens whose fear had once been exploited, whose rights had been trampled. The pattern was undeniable. The department could no longer hide what had been festering beneath its uniform surface. The review board moved swiftly, and the sentence that followed stripped the officer of his rank, his honors, and most importantly, his freedom. He left the courtroom in handcuffs, hurling curses that fell flat against the echo of cheers rising from outside. Justice had begun to take shape, but as the headlines shifted from scandal to reform, Chuck knew the deeper work was only starting. Punishing one man addressed the wound, but not the sickness. Too many others had suffered in silence. Too many officers carried their scars back into the field with no guidance on how to confront them without hurting others. The police chief called Chuck personally, his voice humbled by the events unfolding. He invited Chuck and his daughter to help craft new training programs, lessons in de-escalation, respect, and empathy. Chuck hesitated at first, not out of reluctance, but because of the weight such responsibility carried. Teaching men who already believed they understood power was daunting, but his daughter, sitting beside him, squeezed his arm and nodded. "Let's make something better," she said, and he agreed. Their first day inside the police training auditorium felt surreal. Rows of uniformed officers sat facing them, some with open curiosity, others stiff with resistance. Chuck didn't try to impress them with his reputation or fear them into listening. He stood calm, grounded in his own certainty. He spoke of courage, not the kind that charges into firefights or splits doors off hinges, but the quieter courage required to confront prejudice within oneself, to protect dignity even when no one is watching, to admit mistakes before they become harm. His daughter spoke next. Her wheelchair was no longer a symbol of limitation, but a platform of undeniable truth. She told them what humiliation felt like, how easily a single moment of indignity could fracture confidence built through months of healing. She explained how every building, every sidewalk, every interaction was a battlefield of accessibility, and how an officer's approach could either restore dignity or steal it. Not everyone in the room applauded that day, but they listened, and listening was the first victory. As reforms rolled out, the Rehabilitation Center invited her to speak as well. She shared her story with others recovering from life-altering injuries, newcomers still mourning their former selves. She showed them her camera and told them how her vulnerability became her strength. She insisted they deserved a world that respected them, a world that would fight with them, not against them. Chuck accompanied her wherever she went, not as a guardian hovering in fear, but as a presence of steady support, a reminder that even heroes need love to anchor them. Their lives, once dominated by medical schedules and quiet grief, now thrummed with purpose. Still, healing was not linear. Some nights she woke gasping from dreams of screeching brakes and boots pushing her backward into danger. On those nights, Chuck was always there, sitting nearby until her breathing steadied, reminding her she was not alone anymore. One afternoon, a ceremony was held at the police station, a symbolic unveiling of the new community initiative. The mayor gave a lengthy speech full of polished phrases and hopeful promises. But the moment that mattered came when a new sign was revealed near the entrance. Accessibility and respect. Policy 0. Beneath it, a mission statement written with input from the very woman who had once been shoved out of the road and into the fight. A ramp had been installed at the station's front steps, a structural acknowledgement that change was real. Chuck's daughter approached it slowly, wheels rolling over smooth new concrete. Officers stepped aside to let her be the first to cross it. Applause rose, genuine and warm. When she reached the top, she paused and looked out across the gathered crowd. Her father stood on the sidewalk below, arms folded lightly, pride glowing in his eyes. She smiled at him, just a small one, but full of everything they had endured and overcome. Later they left together, walking and rolling through the same streets where tension once clung like fog. The town no longer felt dangerous. Sunlight warmed the pavement, and storefronts seemed brighter. The poster of the disgraced officer once everywhere had been replaced by flyers for community safety workshops and disability awareness programs. People recognized her and waved, not pitying, but admiring. She reached the same sloping stretch of sidewalk where the nightmare began. Only now, a brand new curb cut provided a smooth transition to the road and back again. The danger that once lurked there had been erased. She stopped and looked toward her father, who watched silently. Then she moved forward down the ramp, across the paved crossing, wheels gliding without hesitation. Chuck followed beside her, steps steady, letting her set the pace. The world felt different under the afternoon sun. Not perfect, but better. "Things won't always be easy," she said quietly, rolling to a stop near a bench beneath an oak tree. "There will be other officers like him out there. Other battles." Chuck sat beside her, hands clasped, gaze soft. "Maybe. But now you know your strength. And more importantly, others have seen it too." She looked ahead at the bustling town, children playing, neighbors chatting, officers patrolling with caution and awareness. For the first time in months, hope didn't feel like a fragile dream. It felt like a promise being fulfilled step by step, wheel by wheel. Chuck placed his hand on hers. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, speckling them both in shifting patterns of gold. "You changed the world today," he said. She shook her head gently. "We did." The breeze carried away the last remnants of fear, and the road ahead, once threatened by danger, now welcomed her forward. Together they moved on,